The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Aldermere Castle like a shroud of secrets waiting to be unveiled. Queen Isabella stood at the tall windows of the blue drawing room, her fingers pressed against the cold glass as she watched the first rays of sunlight pierce through the fog. Behind her, the room buzzed with the quiet efficiency of palace staff preparing for what would become one of the most significant announcements in the kingdom's recent history. Isabella had been Queen Consort of Aldermere for 15 years, having married King Edmund when she was 32 and he was 45. Their union had been one of genuine love rather than political arrangement, a rarity in royal circles that had captured the hearts of their people. Yet now, at 47, Isabella found herself at the center of a decision that would reshape not only her own future but the very structure of the monarchy itself. The sound of footsteps on marble drew her attention. King Edmund entered the room, his usually confident stride showing signs of the weight he carried. At 60, he remained a commanding presence, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his blue eyes sharp with intelligence. But Isabella could see the lines of worry etched deeper around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "The Prime Minister has confirmed the meeting for this afternoon," Edmund said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used when palace business demanded emotional distance. "The cabinet has been briefed on the basic outline, though they don't yet know the full scope of what we're proposing." Isabella turned from the window, her emerald dress catching the morning light. She had chosen the color deliberately, it was the traditional hue of hope in Aldermere, and today they would need all the hope they could muster. "And the children?" "Prince Alexander and Princess Catherine will arrive within the hour," Edmund replied, moving to stand beside her at the window. "They've been told only that we need to discuss important family matters." The Queen nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Their children Alexander, 23 and heir to the throne, and Catherine, 21 and beloved by the public for her charity work, would be among those most affected by today's announcement. The weight of that knowledge pressed against Isabella's chest like a physical burden. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lord Pemberton, the King's private secretary, entered with his characteristic blend of deference and efficiency. At 65, Pemberton had served the crown for over 4 decades, and his lined face had witnessed more royal crises than any man should have to endure. "Your Majesties," Pemberton said, inclining his head. "The Archbishop has arrived and is waiting in the Green Library. The Lord Chancellor is expected momentarily, and I've received confirmation that the Commonwealth representatives will be available for the conference call at 2 o'clock. Isabella felt her stomach tighten. The involvement of the Archbishop and Lord Chancellor meant that the constitutional implications of their decision were as serious as she had feared. The Commonwealth representatives would need to be consulted because any change to the monarchy's structure would ripple across all the realms where Edmund served as head of state. "Thank you, Pemberton," Edmund said. "Please ensure that tea is served in the Green Library, and that we're not disturbed during our preliminary discussions." As Pemberton withdrew, Isabella moved to one of the blue silk armchairs that had been in the royal family for generations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to discuss stepping away from traditions while surrounded by centuries of royal history. "Are you certain about this?" Edmund asked, settling into the chair across from her. The question carried the weight of a husband's concern rather than a king's command, and Isabella felt a familiar warmth toward the man she had loved for 17 years. "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "You know as well as I do that this is the right path forward. The monarchy needs to evolve, and sometimes evolution requires difficult choices." The decision they faced hadn't come suddenly. For months, Isabella had been quietly discussing with Edmund the possibility of establishing a new role within the monarchy, one that would allow her to step back from the traditional duties of queen consort while taking on responsibilities that better aligned with her passions and the changing needs of their people. The idea had originated from Isabella's deep involvement in education reform and mental health advocacy. Over the past 5 years, she had become increasingly frustrated with the ceremonial limitations of her royal role when she saw so many areas where she could make a more meaningful impact. Her background before marriage had been in social work and education policy, expertise that she felt was underutilized in her current position. "The precedent we set today will echo for generations," Edmund continued, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "Alexander will face questions about this decision throughout his eventual reign." Isabella leaned forward, her eyes meeting his with the intensity that had first drawn him to her years ago. "And that's exactly why we need to do this now. Alexander will inherit a monarchy that has shown it can adapt and respond to the needs of its time. We're not weakening the institution, we're strengthening it. The sound of cars arriving in the courtyard below drew their attention back to the window. A black Bentley with royal insignia was pulling up to the main entrance, followed closely by a second vehicle. Isabella recognized the distinctive figure of the Archbishop of Canterbury emerging from the first car, his robes billowing in the morning breeze. "Our children have arrived," Edmund observed, noting the second car. "This conversation is about to become much more complicated." Isabella rose from her chair, smoothing down her dress and checking her appearance in the gilded mirror that hung beside the window. The woman looking back at her appeared calm and regal, but Isabella could see the anxiety in her own eyes. Today would test not only her resolve but the very bonds that held her family together. Prince Alexander was the first to enter the drawing room, his tall frame and dark hair making him appear older than his 23 years. He had inherited his father's commanding presence but his mother's warm brown eyes, a combination that served him well in his public duties. Behind him came Princess Catherine, whose blonde hair and bright smile had made her a favorite with the press and public alike. "Mother, father," Alexander said, his formal greeting reflecting the tension he sensed in the room. Pemberton mentioned this was urgent. Catherine moved to kiss her mother's cheek, her sharp eyes taking in the formal atmosphere. At 21, she had developed an intuition about palace politics that sometimes surprised even seasoned courtiers. "This feels like more than a family discussion," she observed. Edmund gestured for their children to take seats, while Isabella remained standing by the window. The positioning wasn't accidental, she needed to maintain some distance for what was about to unfold. "What we're about to discuss will remain confidential until this afternoon's official announcement," Edmund began, his king's voice replacing his father's tone. "The decision has been made after months of careful consideration and consultation with constitutional experts." Alexander straightened in his chair, his training as heir apparent making him hyper-aware of any significant royal developments. Catherine leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. "Your mother has decided to create a new role within the monarchy," Edmund continued. "She will be stepping down from her traditional duties as queen consort to establish the position of crown advocate for social reform." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concern, and, finally, a careful blankness that Isabella recognized as his public mask. Catherine's reaction was more immediate, her mouth opening slightly before she caught herself. "Stepping down?" Alexander finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. "What does that mean, exactly?" Isabella moved away from the window, choosing to stand rather than sit as she explained the most difficult decision of her royal life. "It means that while I will retain my title and position within the royal family, I will no longer perform the ceremonial duties typically associated with being queen consort. Instead, I will focus entirely on policy work, education reform, and mental health advocacy." "But the constitutional implications," Alexander began. "Have been thoroughly researched," Edmund interrupted. "The Lord Chancellor has confirmed that such a restructuring is possible within our existing framework, though it will require formal approval from Parliament and the Commonwealth realms." Catherine found her voice. "This is about more than just changing your job description, isn't it? This is about fundamentally altering how the monarchy functions." Isabella felt a surge of pride at her daughter's perceptiveness. Catherine had always been the more politically astute of her children, though she often hid that intelligence behind her public persona of charitable glamour. "You're absolutely right," Isabella said. "This is about demonstrating that the monarchy can evolve to meet contemporary needs while maintaining its essential character and traditions." Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window where his mother had been standing. "And what about the impact on me? As heir, how do I explain to the people that my own mother found the traditional role of queen insufficient?" The pain in his voice cut through Isabella's heart like a blade. This was the conversation she had dreaded most, not the constitutional complexities or the public scrutiny, but the moment when her son questioned whether her decision reflected a rejection of everything he was being prepared to inherit. "Alexander," she said gently, moving to stand beside him. "This isn't a rejection of the monarchy or of your future role. This is about creating space within the institution for different types of service." "The press will have a field day," Catherine said quietly. "They'll frame this as the queen abandoning her duties, or worse, as a marriage in crisis." Edmund's jaw tightened at the mention of marriage speculation. The British tabloids had been particularly vicious in recent years, turning every public appearance and royal decision into fuel for their narrative machines. "Let them," Isabella said with more steel in her voice than she felt. We cannot make decisions based on how tabloids might choose to misrepresent them. We have to do what's right for the kingdom and for the future of the monarchy. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of Lord Pemberton again. Your Majesties, the Archbishop is ready for your meeting, and the Prime Minister has requested a brief preliminary call before this afternoon's full briefing. Isabella looked around the room at her family, her husband, whose support had made this decision possible, her son, whose future reign would be shaped by the precedent she was about to set, and her daughter, whose quick mind was already calculating the political ramifications of what was about to unfold. Before we meet with the others, Isabella said, I need you both to understand something. This decision comes from a place of deep love for this family and this institution. I'm not running away from responsibility, I'm trying to redefine what responsibility means for a modern monarchy. Alexander turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. And, if Parliament refuses to approve the change? Then, we'll have learned something important about whether this institution is truly capable of evolution, Edmund replied. But, I believe they will approve it, because they understand as we do that adaptation is the key to survival. Catherine rose from her chair, smoothing down her navy dress. What do you need from us? The question, simple and direct, filled Isabella with gratitude. Whatever private reservations her daughter might have, she was offering her support. I need you to trust that this is the right path, Isabella said. And, I need you to help explain to the people why change doesn't mean abandonment. As the family prepared to leave the blue drawing room for their meetings with church and government officials, Isabella felt the weight of history settling around them. They were about to embark on a course that would either demonstrate the monarchy's capacity for meaningful change or expose the rigid limitations that might ultimately threaten its relevance. The morning mist had lifted from the castle walls, revealing the ancient stones in sharp detail. Isabella took this as a good omen. Clarity was exactly what they would need in the hours and days ahead. The announcement that would reshape the royal family was only hours away, and there would be no turning back once the words were spoken to the world. As they walked through the corridors of Aldermere Castle, passing portraits of kings and queens who had faced their own moments of historical significance, Isabella reflected on the path that had led to this moment. The decision to create the role of Crown Advocate for social reform hadn't been made lightly or quickly. It represented months of careful planning, constitutional research, and soul-searching about how best to serve her people and her family. The Green Library awaited, along with the Archbishop, the Lord Chancellor, and a future that would be unlike anything the monarchy had experienced before. Isabella straightened her shoulders, drew a deep breath, and stepped forward into history. The Green Library of Aldermere Castle had witnessed centuries of momentous decisions, but perhaps none quite like the one about to unfold within its book-lined walls. Archbishop Michael Thornfield stood near the magnificent oak table that dominated the center of the room, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the leather-bound volumes that reached from floor to ceiling. At 72, he had served as spiritual advisor to the royal family for over a decade, and his presence today spoke to the constitutional gravity of Queen Isabella's proposed new role. Lord Chancellor Victoria Hastings arrived precisely as the clock tower chimed 11, her sharp grey suit and equally sharp intellect making her a formidable presence in any room. As the highest-ranking legal officer in the kingdom, her approval would be crucial for the constitutional changes Isabella sought to implement. She carried a thick briefcase that contained months of legal research and precedent analysis. King Edmund entered first, followed by Queen Isabella and their children. The Archbishop inclined his head respectfully, while the Lord Chancellor offered a formal curtsy that spoke more to constitutional protocol than personal deference. Your Majesties, Archbishop Thornfield said, his voice carrying the measured cadence that had comforted the royal family through numerous crises. I confess that when Lord Pemberton first outlined the nature of today's discussion, I spent considerable time in prayer seeking wisdom for the guidance you've requested. Isabella took her seat at the table, her posture erect despite the anxiety that churned in her stomach. Archbishop, I hope you'll understand that this decision comes from a deep sense of calling rather than any dissatisfaction with my current role. Your Majesty, the Lord Chancellor interjected, opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency, before we discuss the spiritual implications, perhaps we should address the legal framework that would govern such a change. She withdrew a thick document bound in red leather, the traditional color for constitutional matters in Aldermere. The position of Queen Consort is not explicitly defined in our written constitution, which actually works in our favor. The role has evolved through tradition and precedent rather than legal mandate. Prince Alexander leaned forward, his legal education at Cambridge serving him well in following the technical discussion. So there's no constitutional barrier to redefining the role? Not precisely, Lord Chancellor Hastings replied, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. However, any significant change would require approval from Parliament, formal notification to the Commonwealth realms, and, potentially new legislation to define the Crown Advocate position within the existing legal structure. Archbishop Thornfield moved to the window, his reflection ghostly against the diamond-paned glass. The spiritual and symbolic aspects are perhaps more complex than the legal ones. The Queen Consort traditionally serves as a bridge between the Crown and the people, embodying the softer aspects of royal service. We must consider how this change might affect that crucial connection. Isabella had anticipated this concern and had spent weeks formulating her response. Archbishop, I would argue that the Crown Advocate role would strengthen that connection rather than weaken it. Instead of ceremonial engagement, we're talking about direct policy involvement and tangible impact on people's lives. But, at what cost? Princess Catherine asked quietly. She had been largely silent since entering the library, but her question carried the weight of genuine concern. Mother, you're not just changing your job, you're changing what it means to be a royal consort in this kingdom. The truth of her daughter's observation settled heavily in the room. Edmund reached across the table to touch Isabella's hand, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by their audience. Catherine raises an important point, Edmund said. This decision will establish a precedent that will influence royal marriages for generations to come. We need to be absolutely certain we're making the right choice. Lord Chancellor Hastings consulted her notes, her expression thoughtful. Your Majesty, in my research, I found several historical instances where royal roles were redefined due to changing circumstances. Queen Victoria's expansion of royal influence during her reign, King George VI's transformation of the monarchy during the war years. The institution has always adapted when adaptation served the greater good. But those changes were responses to external crises, Archbishop Thornfield observed. What we're discussing today is a proactive restructuring during a time of relative stability. The justification becomes more complex. Isabella rose from her chair, moving to the fireplace where portraits of her predecessors looked down from gilded frames. Each queen consort had faced her own challenges, but none had deliberately sought to reshape the role itself. The crisis isn't external, she said, her voice gaining strength. It's internal. We have a monarchy that risks becoming increasingly irrelevant if it cannot demonstrate meaningful contribution to contemporary society. I've spent 15 years cutting ribbons and attending galas while holding expertise in education and social policy that could genuinely help people. The public values those ceremonial functions, Alexander pointed out. They provide stability and continuity in an increasingly chaotic world. And they'll continue, Isabella replied, turning back to face the group. The king will maintain all traditional ceremonial duties. The Prince of Wales will expand his public role to cover some of my former engagements. Princess Catherine has already expressed interest in taking on additional charitable patronages. Catherine nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I'm willing to help bridge any gaps, but I'm concerned about the message this sends about commitment to duty. The Archbishop moved closer to the group, his hands now clasped in front of him in a gesture that Isabella recognized as his thinking pose. Your Majesty, help me understand the spiritual dimension of this calling. How do you reconcile stepping away from traditional duty with the concept of service that defines monarchy? This was the question Isabella had wrestled with most deeply during her months of consideration. Her answer would reveal the core motivation behind her dramatic decision. Archbishop, when I married Edmund, I pledged to serve the crown and the people of this kingdom. For 15 years, I've honored that pledge through the traditional means available to a queen consort. But service isn't static, it should evolve to meet the needs of those being served. She moved back to the table, her hands resting on the red leather constitutional document. I've watched Parliament struggle with education reform while possessing detailed knowledge of successful international models. I've attended mental health awareness events while having the expertise to contribute to actual policy development. The traditional role forces me to be a symbol when I could be a solution. Lord Chancellor Hastings made several notes, her pen scratching across the legal pad with sharp precision. Your Majesty, if Parliament approves this restructuring, the Crown Advocate position would need clearly defined boundaries. We cannot have a member of the royal family directly interfering in political processes. Agreed completely, Edmund said. The role would be advisory and educational, working within existing constitutional limits. Isabella would collaborate with government departments and international organizations to develop policy recommendations, but implementation would remain entirely within democratic processes.
Think tank rather than think do, Alexander said, his understanding of the limitations becoming clearer.
Exactly, Isabella confirmed. Influence through expertise rather than authority through position. The Archbishop returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. I find myself torn between admiration for your Majesty's desire to maximize your service and concern about the precedent this sets.
What happens when future royal consorts decide their traditional duties are insufficient?
Then, we'll have a monarchy that continues to evolve in response to changing needs and capabilities, Isabella replied without hesitation.
Isn't that preferable to an institution that refuses to adapt?
A soft knock interrupted the discussion. Lord Pemberton entered with a tea service, the normalcy of the ritual providing a brief respite from the intensity of the constitutional debate. As the delicate china cups were distributed and the familiar ceremony of afternoon tea commenced, the weight of their discussion seemed to settle more deeply into the room. The Prime Minister will expect a detailed briefing on the legal implications, Lord Chancellor Hastings said, sipping her tea. Parliament will need to understand exactly what powers and limitations the Crown Advocate position would entail.
We've prepared comprehensive documentation, Edmund assured her.
The role would be advisory only, with no executive authority and no formal political power. Isabella would work through existing government channels and international partnerships to provide expert input on policy development.
And the Commonwealth realms? Catherine asked. How do we explain to 14 other countries that the Queen Consort is essentially changing jobs? This question had kept Isabella awake many nights.
The Commonwealth realms, from Canada to Australia to Jamaica, would need to understand and accept the change, as it would affect how the monarchy functioned across all territories.
We emphasize the strengthening rather than weakening aspect, Isabella said.
The Commonwealth has always benefited from knowledge sharing and collaborative policy development.
The Crown Advocate role would formalize the royal family's contribution to that process.
Archbishop Thornfield set down his teacup with deliberate care.
Your Majesty, I must ask directly, is there any possibility that this decision reflects personal dissatisfaction with your marriage or your role within the royal family?
The public will certainly speculate along those lines. The question hung in the air like an accusation, though Isabella recognized it as necessary rather than malicious.
Public perception would be crucial to the success of any constitutional change.
Archbishop, my marriage to Edmund is stronger today than it was 17 years ago. This decision has his complete support because he understands that a fulfilled and purposeful queen consort serves the monarchy better than one constrained by traditions that no longer fit contemporary needs.
Edmund nodded his agreement.
If anything, this change strengthens our partnership because it allows Isabella to contribute her full capabilities rather than just a fraction of them. Lord Chancellor Hastings consulted her watch, a subtle reminder that time was pressing toward the afternoon's official announcements.
Your Majesties, I need to prepare the Prime Minister and Cabinet for what they'll be hearing in a few hours. Is there anything else I should emphasize about the legal framework? Emphasize that this is evolution, not revolution, Isabella said.
We're adapting the monarchy to better serve contemporary needs while maintaining all essential constitutional functions.
And, if Parliament rejects the proposal? Alexander asked, voicing the concern that lurked beneath all their discussions.
Then, we'll have learned that the monarchy is less adaptable than we hoped, Edmund replied.
But, I don't believe that will happen. Parliament understands the need for institutional evolution.
As the meeting in the Green Library concluded, Isabella felt the weight of the approaching announcement settling around her like a cloak. In less than 3 hours, she would stand before the cameras and explain to the world why she was choosing to redefine what it meant to be a royal consort in the 21st century. The Archbishop offered a final blessing, his words carrying both support and concern. Lord Chancellor Hastings promised that all legal documentation would be ready for Parliament within the week. Alexander and Catherine embraced their mother, their initial shock giving way to understanding and support. As the various participants departed to prepare for the afternoon's events, Isabella remained in the library with Edmund. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the understanding that comes from 17 years of marriage and 15 years of shared royal duty.
Any regrets?
Edmund asked, his hand finding hers across the ancient oak table. Only that it took me so long to realize this was possible, Isabella replied.
We're about to make history, aren't we? We're about to try, Edmund corrected gently. Whether it becomes history or cautionary tale depends on what happens next. Through the library windows, Isabella could see the media vans beginning to arrive at the castle gates. Word of the impending announcement had leaked, as royal news always did, and the world was preparing to hear what Queen Isabella had to say about her future. The next few hours would determine whether her vision of evolved royal service would become reality or remain an ambitious dream that died in constitutional complexity. The Great Hall of Aldermere Castle had been transformed into a media center that would have made any television studio envious. Cameras from major networks around the world were positioned at precise angles to capture both the grandeur of the ancient room and the intimacy of what would be a deeply personal announcement. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the stone floor, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere for what was about to unfold. Queen Isabella stood before her dressing room mirror, her hands steady as she applied the final touches of lipstick that would carry her voice to millions of people across the globe. She had chosen a deep burgundy dress, the color of strength and dignity, with the sapphire brooch that had belonged to her predecessor, Queen Eleanor. The jewelry served as a bridge between past and future, honoring tradition while stepping toward change. A gentle knock at the door announced the arrival of her personal secretary, Margaret Fairfield, who had served the royal household for over 20 years. Margaret's usually calm demeanor showed signs of strain as she clutched a tablet displaying real-time social media feeds and news updates. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled, "the preliminary reports are already generating significant discussion. The hashtag Queen Isabella is trending worldwide, and the palace switchboard has received over 3,000 calls in the past hour." Isabella turned from the mirror, her reflection revealing the composed facade she had perfected over 15 years of public life. Beneath the surface, however, her heart raced with the knowledge that the next hour would irrevocably change not only her life but the very nature of monarchy in Aldermere. "What's the general sentiment?" Isabella asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Margaret consulted her tablet, scrolling through the endless stream of comments and reactions. "Mixed, as expected. There's significant support from women's advocacy groups and education reform organizations. However, traditional monarchy supporters are expressing concern, and some members of parliament have already issued statements calling for more information before making any commitments." The door opened again to admit King Edmund, resplendent in his formal military uniform with the blue sash of the Order of the Golden Lion. Behind him came Prince Alexander and Princess Catherine, both dressed with the careful attention to detail that royal appearances demanded. The family's solidarity would be crucial to the public's acceptance of Isabella's announcement. "The Prime Minister has confirmed that Parliament will convene an emergency session tomorrow morning," Edmund informed them, his tone businesslike despite the personal nature of their gathering. "The Commonwealth representatives have been briefed and are prepared to issue supportive statements following your announcement." Alexander adjusted his tie nervously, a gesture that reminded Isabella of the young boy he had been when she first joined the royal family. At 23, he was now a man preparing for the throne, but moments like this revealed the uncertainty that still lived beneath his public confidence. "Mother," Alexander said, "I want you to know that despite my initial reservations, I understand what you're trying to accomplish. The monarchy needs to demonstrate that it can evolve without losing its essential character." Catherine nodded her agreement, though her expression remained thoughtful. "The key will be helping people understand that change doesn't mean abandonment. You're not walking away from duty, you're redefining what duty means." A sharp rap on the door indicated that Lord Pemberton was ready to escort them to the Great Hall. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the sapphire brooch against her chest like a talisman connecting her to the generations of royal women who had faced their own moments of historical significance. The Great Hall fell silent as the royal family entered through the main doors. Isabella had attended thousands of public events over the past 15 years, but the atmosphere in the room felt different, charged with anticipation and the knowledge that history was about to be made. The assembled media representatives rose respectfully as the family took their positions near the podium that had been set up beneath the ancient coat of arms of Aldermere. Prime Minister James Morrison sat in the front row, his silver hair and distinguished bearing reflecting the gravitas he brought to the constitutional complexities of the day. Beside him sat the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose presence lent spiritual authority to the proceedings. The Lord Chancellor had positioned herself where she could observe both the royal family and the media's reactions, her legal mind already calculating the political ramifications of whatever Isabella was about to say. Isabella stepped to the podium, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood as she looked out at the cameras that would carry her words around the world. She could feel the presence of her family behind her, their support flowing toward her like a warm current.
Ladies and gentlemen, Isabella began, her voice clear and strong despite the magnitude of the moment. I appear before you today to announce a decision that has been months in the making and has involved careful consultation with constitutional experts, government officials, and, most importantly, my family. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the room. Behind the cameras, she could see palace staff members who had worked with her for years, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and concern for the woman they had come to respect. For 15 years, I have had the privilege of serving as Queen Consort of Aldermere, a role that has allowed me to support my husband's reign while engaging with causes and organizations across our kingdom and the Commonwealth. During this time, I have cut ribbons, attended galas, and participated in countless ceremonial functions that connect the monarchy to the daily lives of our people. Isabella's voice grew stronger as she moved into the heart of her announcement. However, I have also witnessed firsthand the complex challenges facing our society, challenges in education, mental health care, social policy, and international cooperation. As someone who worked in education policy and social services before my marriage, I have felt increasingly called to contribute more directly to addressing these challenges. The room remained absolutely silent, the only sound the software of cameras capturing every word and gesture for posterity. Therefore, after extensive consultation and, with the full support of His Majesty the King, I am announcing my intention to transition from the traditional role of Queen Consort to a newly created position, Crown Advocate for Social Reform. A murmur ran through the assembled media, though the trained professionalism of the reporters kept any outbursts to a minimum. Isabella could see phones and tablets lighting up as news outlets began pushing out breaking news alerts to their audiences. This transition does not represent a reduction in my commitment to the crown or to the people of this kingdom, Isabella continued, her voice carrying the conviction that had sustained her through months of difficult decisions. Rather, it represents an evolution in how that commitment is expressed. Instead of symbolic engagement, I will focus on substantive policy work, collaborating with government departments, educational institutions, and international organizations to develop evidence-based solutions to contemporary challenges. She looked directly into the main camera, knowing that her words would reach far beyond the confines of the Great Hall. The monarchy has always been strongest when it adapts to serve the changing needs of its people while maintaining its essential constitutional role. Today's announcement represents the tradition of adaptation. King Edmund stepped forward, positioning himself beside his wife at the podium. The gesture spoke more powerfully than words about the solidarity of their marriage and their shared commitment to the decision. Queen Isabella's new role has my complete support, Edmund said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years on the throne. The Crown Advocate for Social Reform will work within existing constitutional boundaries to provide expert guidance and policy development support. This is not a political position but rather an advisory and educational one that will strengthen our kingdom's ability to address complex social challenges. Prince Alexander moved to join his parents, his presence signaling the next generation's support for the change. The Prince of Wales will be expanding my public duties to ensure continuity in the ceremonial functions that connect the royal family to communities across our kingdom, he announced. This transition represents growth rather than reduction in royal service. Princess Catherine completed the family tableau, her bright smile conveying confidence despite the uncertainty that surrounded them all. As a family, we are committed to demonstrating that the monarchy can evolve while maintaining the values and traditions that define our service to this kingdom. Isabella returned to the podium for the final portion of her announcement, knowing that her closing words would be quoted and analyzed for years to come. Change is never easy, particularly when it involves institutions and traditions that have served our kingdom well for centuries, she said. However, I believe that our greatest service to those traditions lies not in preserving them unchanged but in ensuring they continue to provide meaningful value to the people they are meant to serve. She paused, her eyes finding familiar faces in the crowd, staff members who had become friends, officials who had become partners in service, and reporters who had covered her public life with varying degrees of sympathy and criticism. The role of Crown Advocate for Social Reform will require parliamentary approval and constitutional review. I am confident that these processes will demonstrate both the legal soundness of this transition and its potential to strengthen rather than weaken our constitutional monarchy. Isabella stepped back from the podium, signaling the end of her prepared remarks. The room erupted in a controlled chaos of questions shouted by reporters, camera flashes, and the scramble of media professionals racing to file their stories. Lord Pemberton stepped forward to manage the question period, his decades of experience evident in how smoothly he facilitated the exchange. Your Majesty, called out Sarah Chun from the Royal Broadcasting Corporation, how do you respond to critics who might view this as abandoning your traditional duties? Isabella returned to the podium, her composure intact despite the intensity of the moment. I would ask those critics to consider whether symbolic service or substantive service better serves the people of this kingdom. The traditional duties of Queen Consort will continue through other members of the royal family, while the new role allows for direct contribution to policy development and social progress.
Your Majesty, shouted James Walsh from the International News Network, what safeguards will prevent the Crown Advocate role from becoming politically partisan?
King Edmund fielded this question, his constitutional expertise evident in his response.
The Crown Advocate will work within the same constitutional constraints that govern all royal family members.
The role will be advisory and educational, with no executive authority and no involvement in partisan political processes. The questions continued for 20 minutes, covering everything from the constitutional implications to the personal motivations behind Isabella's decision. Throughout the interrogation, the royal family maintained their united front, each member contributing to the explanation of what they viewed as an evolution rather than a revolution. As the formal announcement concluded and the media began filing their reports, Isabella felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The public declaration had been made, but the real work of implementing the change was just beginning. Parliament would debate, constitutional experts would analyze, and the people of Aldermere would ultimately judge whether their queen consort had made a wise choice or a costly mistake. Standing in the great hall as the cameras were dismantled and the media departed, Isabella looked around at the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but today had been about courage, the courage to believe that even the most traditional institutions could find new ways to serve their people. The announcement was complete, but the transformation of the monarchy had only just begun. 3 months after Queen Isabella's historic announcement, the Kingdom of Aldermere found itself in the midst of a constitutional evolution that no one could have predicted. The initial storm of media coverage had given way to careful analysis and political debate, while the royal family worked to demonstrate that their bold experiment in modernizing monarchy was yielding tangible benefits for the people they served. Isabella stood in her new office in the east wing of Aldermere Castle, a space that had been transformed from a formal reception room into a working policy center. Gone were the ornate furnishings and ceremonial portraits, replaced by modern computers, research libraries, and conference equipment that reflected her new role as Crown Advocate for social reform. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated wall charts showing education statistics, mental health data, and social mobility indicators that had become the focus of her professional life. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Parliament's emergency session 3 months earlier had resulted in heated debate that stretched across party lines, with traditionalist members expressing concern about the precedent being set and progressive voices arguing for even more substantial reforms. The vote to approve Isabella's new role had passed by a margin of 62%, enough to provide legitimacy but narrow enough to ensure continued scrutiny. A gentle knock at the door interrupted Isabella's review of the latest international education reports. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, her newly appointed policy advisor, entered carrying a stack of briefing documents that represented the scope of Isabella's expanding influence. Your Majesty, Dr. Mitchell said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had replaced the formal Baroque furniture, the preliminary results from the pilot mental health program are remarkable. The schools implementing your recommendations are showing a 30% reduction in student anxiety-related absences. Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction that was entirely different from the polite applause that had followed her ceremonial ribbon cuttings. These numbers represented real improvement in young people's lives, the kind of substantive impact she had dreamed of making during her years of traditional royal duties. What about the Education Ministry's response? Isabella asked, reviewing the data charts that Dr. Mitchell had prepared. Are they ready to expand the program nationally? Minister Harrison is cautiously optimistic, Dr. Mitchell replied. He's requested a full presentation to the Education Committee next month, with particular focus on the cost-benefit analysis and long-term sustainability. The mention of Minister Harrison reminded Isabella of how dramatically her relationship with government officials had changed. As Queen Consort, her interactions had been formal and largely ceremonial. As Crown Advocate, she now participated in working meetings where her expertise was valued over her title. King Edmund appeared in the doorway, his morning constitutional completed and his attention turning to the affairs of state that filled his days. At 60, he had embraced the changes in their partnership with characteristic grace, though Isabella sometimes caught glimpses of concern in his eyes when the media coverage turned particularly critical. The Prime Minister has requested a briefing on your Commonwealth Education Initiative, Edmund said, settling into the chair beside Dr. Mitchell. The Canadian and Australian representatives are very interested in the collaborative framework you've developed. Isabella's Commonwealth work had become one of the most successful aspects of her new role. By leveraging the existing relationships between Commonwealth nations, she had been able to facilitate knowledge sharing and policy coordination that transcended traditional diplomatic channels. The video conference is scheduled for this afternoon, Isabella confirmed. We're discussing the establishment of a Commonwealth Centre for Educational Innovation that would formalize the collaborative research we've been doing informally. Dr. Mitchell consulted her tablet, scrolling through the dozens of international partnerships that had emerged from Isabella's work. Your Majesty, the interest from non-Commonwealth countries has been unexpected but encouraging. The Nordic Council has requested a consultation on implementing similar mental health protocols in their school systems. The expansion beyond Commonwealth boundaries had surprised everyone, including Isabella herself. What had begun as a way to maximize her existing royal connections had evolved into something approaching international educational diplomacy. Speaking of unexpected developments, Edmund said with a slight smile, Catherine's patronage applications have tripled since your announcement. Apparently, young women across the kingdom see her as representing a new model of royal service. Princess Catherine had indeed emerged as one of the unexpected beneficiaries of Isabella's transformation. By taking on additional charitable responsibilities while maintaining her natural warmth and accessibility, she had captured public imagination in ways that surprised even experienced royal watchers. And Alexander? Isabella asked, knowing that her son had faced the most difficult adjustment to the family's new dynamic. Learning, Edmund replied diplomatically. Yesterday's university visit went well. The students responded positively to his questions about their career concerns and employment prospects. He's developing his own approach to meaningful public engagement. The transition hadn't been seamless for any of them, but Isabella was particularly aware of the pressure on Alexander to justify a decision that some critics viewed as his mother's rejection of traditional royal values. His eventual reign would be shaped by the precedent she had set, and that weight was visible in his increasingly thoughtful approach to public duties. A sharp ring from the secure telephone interrupted their discussion. Lord Pemberton's voice came through the speaker with the brisk efficiency that characterized all palace communications. Your Majesty, the Lord Chancellor is requesting an urgent consultation regarding the Constitutional Review Committee's preliminary findings. Isabella exchanged glances with Edmund, both recognizing the potential significance of the call. The Constitutional Review Committee had been established to examine the broader implications of her role change and to consider whether additional reforms might be beneficial or necessary. Transfer the call to the secure line, Isabella instructed, moving to her desk where the red telephone reserved for the most sensitive government communications awaited. Lord Chancellor Victoria Hastings' voice carried a mixture of excitement and caution that immediately captured Isabella's attention. Your Majesty, the committee's initial findings are more positive than we anticipated. However, they're also raising questions about whether the Crown Advocate model should be expanded to include other areas of expertise. What kind of expansion? Isabella asked, her mind already racing through the implications of such a development. The committee is discussing the possibility of creating additional specialized roles within the royal family, perhaps a Crown Advocate for environmental policy or a Crown Advocate for international trade. The success of your position has prompted broader thinking about how royal expertise could be maximized. Isabella felt a mixture of pride and concern. The success of her role was gratifying, but the prospect of fundamentally restructuring the entire royal family around specialized policy expertise represented a much more radical change than anything she had envisioned. What's the king's initial reaction? Lord Chancellor Hastings asked, clearly aware that Edmund was listening to the conversation. Intrigued but cautious, Edmund replied. We need to be careful not to create a situation where the royal family becomes a shadow government or where our constitutional neutrality is compromised. Agreed completely, Isabella said. The strength of the Crown Advocate model lies in its advisory nature and its respect for democratic processes. Any expansion would need to maintain those fundamental principles. After concluding the call with the Lord Chancellor, the small group in Isabella's office sat in contemplative silence. The implications of the Constitutional Committee's thinking extended far beyond Isabella's personal transformation to encompass the future direction of monarchy itself. Are we creating something we can't control? Dr. Mitchell asked quietly, voicing the concern that lurked beneath their satisfaction with recent successes. Isabella moved to the window, looking out at the castle gardens where tourists and locals mingled in the sunshine. The sight reminded her that their constitutional experiments ultimately served the people walking those paths, people who deserved a monarchy that contributed meaningfully to their lives and their future. "We're creating something that serves a genuine need," Isabella replied. "The question is whether we're wise enough to manage its growth responsibly." Edmund joined her at the window, his presence a reminder of the partnership that had made all of this possible. "The committee's findings suggest that we've opened a door that others want to walk through. We need to decide whether that's an opportunity or a threat." "Both," Isabella said without hesitation. "Which means we need to be very careful about what happens next." The afternoon brought a flurry of activity that demonstrated how dramatically Isabella's daily life had changed. The Commonwealth Education Conference call involved representatives from 12 countries discussing collaborative research initiatives that would have been impossible through traditional diplomatic channels. The conversation was technical, substantive, and focused entirely on improving educational outcomes for millions of young people. Following the conference call, Isabella met with a delegation of mental health professionals who had been implementing her recommended protocols in schools across the kingdom. Their reports of reduced anxiety, improved academic performance, and better teacher-student relationships represented exactly the kind of measurable impact she had hoped to achieve. The day's final meeting was perhaps the most significant, a private consultation with Prince Alexander about his evolving role within the transformed royal family. At 23, he was old enough to understand the implications of his mother's changes but young enough to adapt his own approach to royal service based on what he was learning. "I've been thinking about what kind of king I want to be," Alexander said as they walked through the castle's ancient corridors. "Your transformation has shown me that traditions can be honored while still being evolved." Isabella felt a rush of maternal pride at her son's thoughtfulness. The pressure on him had been intense, but he was emerging from the experience with a deeper understanding of leadership and service. "What conclusions have you reached?" Isabella asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "That the monarchy's greatest strength lies not in maintaining unchanged traditions but in maintaining unchanging values while adapting how those values are expressed," Alexander replied. "Your work in education and mental health serves the same values of service and care that guided Queen Eleanor's hospital visits 50 years ago." The wisdom in his answer reminded Isabella that the next generation might be better prepared for institutional evolution than anyone had imagined. Alexander was learning to think of monarchy as a service rather than a status, a perspective that would serve him well when his time came to lead. As evening settled over Aldermere Castle, Isabella returned to her transformed office to review the day's accomplishments and plan for tomorrow's challenges. The stack of policy reports on her desk represented ongoing work that would improve thousands of lives, while the Constitutional Review Committee's findings suggested that her experiment in royal evolution might be just the beginning of broader changes. King Edmund found her there as the clock tower chimed 9, working by lamplight as she had done for countless nights during her months of planning this transformation. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. Isabella considered the question seriously, reviewing not just the day but the entire 3 months since her announcement. The work was challenging, the criticism was sometimes harsh, and the pressure was relentless. But the impact was real, the partnerships were meaningful, and the future possibilities were genuinely exciting. "None," she said finally. "Though I suspect the hardest decisions are still ahead of us." "The Constitutional Committee's recommendations?" "Among other things. We're going to have to decide how far we're willing to let this evolution go, and how to maintain the essential character of monarchy while adapting to contemporary needs." Edmund nodded, his expression thoughtful. "History will judge whether we made the right choice." Isabella looked around her office, at the policy charts and research documents that had replaced ceremonial photographs and formal portraits. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new decisions about the future of royal service. But tonight, she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from work that mattered. "History will judge whether we had the courage to try," she corrected. "I think we've answered that question." Outside the castle walls, the kingdom of Aldermere continued its daily life, largely unaware that the transformation of its monarchy was far from complete. The announcement that had shocked the world 3 months earlier had been just the beginning of a journey that would ultimately redefine what it meant to serve the crown in the 21st century. Queen Isabella's experiment in royal evolution had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but its ultimate impact would be measured not in months but in the generations that would inherit the new model of monarchical service she had created.